The Boldly Now Show. Burning desire. Big ideas. Bold action.
Hi, and welcome to the Boldly Now Show. I'm Michael-Shaun Conaway.
And I'm Rachel Morrison. And today we're going to be discussing planetary intelligence.
Planetary intelligence in terms of a thriving future for humanity. Standing out, looking back, we have a much better chance of having real intelligence. Intelligence that takes into account more than just our current circumstances. And as we know right now, the current circumstances in the world lead us to believe that everything's broken and our future is likely to be not so great. We at Boldly Now actually have a difference in opinion with that. We believe that together, collectively, as in collective intelligence, we can generate a thriving future for humanity. The first thing to think about in regards to that and the things that we want you guys to take into this conversation is really how we experience the world today is framed and shaped by our view of what everything means, or the causality of meaning. So in what context are we looking at today's circumstances? And that's a really great place to start. So for me, I look at if I'm looking out in the world and I'm seeing things that are broken, I'm seeing the pandemic, systemic racism, obviously big problems with political division and divisiveness of all kinds, I might be tempted to look out into the future and say, wow, if we don't handle these really near-term problems, things are probably going to get worse. And in fact, there's lots of people that will tell us all the things that are going wrong. And if you look at news media today, you're probably overwhelmed by the number of things that are going wrong. Given that we live inside of the context of our lives, or the story of our lives, what might be a different way to look at the world that might give us a little bit more power and agency in that? I'll throw that one to you, Rachel.
Well, there's lots of things that we can look at in the world. And for starters, I think it's how we perceive the world as something separate than ourselves. Now is the time where we get to actually transcend our current view of the world and realize that as a collective, for the first time possibly in the history of time, since we have the, as Aguirre's would say, the noosphere aware of itself, here we are all having the same conversation together, that we have the ability to understand fully for the first time at the same time that we are not separate from the world, that we are shifting into. The world itself is not separate from us. We are not separate from it, nor are we separate from each other or anything that exists in it. And from that place, we can open up into a space of universal intelligence that allows us to create and become exponentially exceptional together.
Right, and I like what you said about together. I was on a call today, and somebody said, "Yeah, we've hit peak individuation." It's like, oh, we have striven so long to define ourselves individually as separate from other, different from other, and in most cases more special than other in one way or another, or our group is more special or has access to more information or the right view. And we really have hit a point where, when we talk about divisiveness, who is being divisive? Well, we're being divisive. We are separating ourselves from others. And the Thich Nhat Hanh quote, I transform the garbage in myself so that you live in a beautiful world, really comes to mind. So anytime we see something out in the world, we have to look around and think, wow, what is it that I am manifesting in this moment? And how is it that I'm rejecting something that I don't like or don't believe in? Now, that this is all common ground. You guys have been through this. You have a deep understanding of this, I think, in many ways. But the kind of special aspect that I'd like to bring to this is when we begin to think beyond our lifetimes, and we begin to think of the human beings and the other species on the planet and the planet itself. What are we leaving behind in time? It gives us a little bit of access to thinking about and being for something beyond ourselves and beyond our lifetime, and that gives us that sense of like, oh, we can consider it all as one thing. I don't actually have to deal with whatever my common day-to-day stresses are. I don't have to deal with what's going to happen next fall. Our school's going to open. Am I going to be able to have my business be successful? And I'm able to start to go, okay, so all that got handled some way or another. And my life turned out as it turned out, and my time came to an end. What is left behind? And I think our Indigenous elders often talk about, the impact of generations, but it's not a practice we do very much. We can think about our kids sometimes, and maybe our grandkids, especially if we have them at this point, but we don't tend to think of our descendants as something that is here now, that is something that we actually are together as one through time, and therefore we don't have much access to what kinds of responsibilities come with that, and B, what kind of freedom we can get from the conditions and constraints of our own life, free to dream of what might constitute thriving, what might constitute health for the planet or health for other species. Instead, we try to dream inside of the container we're in. Well, like I would be for thriving of a certain ecosystem if I didn't have to suffer because of it. Or I would be for the thriving of this species or that species, but actually that impacts my world. And so we get constrained by thinking, if the world's going to thrive, I'm not going to thrive. If we can get out beyond that, then we can actually get beyond the constraint. Look, we don't want to imagine and design a future in a world for our own limitations. We want to design beyond the limitations. We want to dream into our best expression. And I don't mean our best expression, those of you who are listening to this show, but I do mean all beings, 100% of life.
Absolutely. And from that perspective, I want to bring in something that is very boldly now. And you mentioned prophecy, Indigenous prophecy. And I don't know if you've heard or not, but this past week, the North Dakota pipeline was ordered to be shut down. And for many of us in the Unify family, that was a very important time of remembering and bringing things into focus. Most importantly, because we're talking about the boldly now and the aspect of prophecy and the ancient wisdom that we're bringing forward into the world, there was 2 prophecies of that time that I believe that we're living out today, that of the black snake and that of the 7 generations. And from that perspective, there was something really interesting that was said, that if the water turned black in that particular area, then the world would become sick. That's the first piece. The second piece is that the 7 generations were going to come together of many colors and take full responsibility of the world that they were going to create moving forward. That's the synopsis of that time. And so there's a unique opportunity that we have here to live into the prophecies that actually create a generative future as opposed to a predictive future that many of us assume is going to happen. A friend of mine sent me an article just the other day saying something along the lines that by a certain amount of time in the very near future, we'd be lucky to have jellyfish here. And I'm not one to subscribe to a reality where that's being created, because we here in this collective that I think we're all tuning into and building the substance to create the universal communication technology of biospheric consciousness and biospheric awareness. And biospheric awareness was a term that was originally coined by the economist Jeremy Rifkin in understanding how to revalue systems for the planet. And the evolution of that is to understand that we, as a species who has the ability to differentiate, right? That's how we experience the extreme levels of isolation and indifference that we have in the world today, have the ability to speak to the unifying principles just as much as we have to speak to the principles that divide us. And so to understand how to use biospheric communication technology from the ancient future really means that we're choosing to embody all of the life on this planet that has and does not have a voice. So the trees, the water, the animals, the children, anything that is here now, and the shoulders of whom we stand on, and the future we choose to orient ourselves to, allowing our small self to step aside for a moment and let the wisdom and the will of all of that I just spoke to be the voice that animates this body in this moment, quite possibly the way that Mark Sims earlier was speaking about how his experience of communication can come through. We all have an ability to do that in a very unique way. And imagine what could happen if we all did that together in one room, or in one UN floor, or in one congregation, and the list could go on and on. But I think very soon in this moment, and in the moments building up to the great meditation that we're going to have coming up later in the week, that we will have an ability to step into that and realize what could happen from the collective experience.
And I just want to point out something, and I'll make a very good example of this. What Rachel's talking about is not woo-woo. It's not that we need to connect in some kind of etheric way. We actually need to connect, like speaking, like drawings, like looking at impacts of things. And I think the North Dakota Access Pipeline is a great example. Right now we as a North American collective of people have not dealt with our dependency on petroleum-based products. Now, we make an unchoiced choice. So we use a lot of plastic. Where does plastic come from? It comes to oil. So we buy things that are disposable, or even things that we don't need. And where does that come from? Where does that manufacturing process? Where does the energy come from? What comes from oil? So we create an environment in which we need a lot of oil, not just for energy, but for creating the materials we're using. Now, do we do that consciously, or do we do that out of a desiring space, or a hungry ghost body? I think it's mostly out of that. I don't think we're really conscious about the way we use things. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't make computers. Yeah, computers are really handy. I'm sure this camera in front of us has parts made out of petroleum, all very, very good. But we shouldn't be using that lightly. It is if you will, a magical alchemical process to create these objects, and it should be done with some reverence and respect. And so then okay, so we have a lack of responsibility about oil, and then we have then a political system that really favors white culture, and I'll say it very plainly, white male culture, really, really clearly. And so why did the pipeline go through that area of North Dakota? Is because they had the people with the least amount of power were in the way. Now, does that make sense given the system we have? Yeah, it makes sense. Is it tragic? Yes, it's tragic. But the solution here is not just to say, okay, no pipeline, and no more power. Like, we're all going to just be chill on the land. No, actually, we have to take responsibility like grown-up adults. We have to have conversations. And what we would say at Boldly Now, we have to have conversations for a future, a collective future, where the Indigenous people, the Dakota, from North Dakota and South Dakota, which is impacted by this, have a seat at the table. And their prophecies and their wisdom has a seat at the table. And the executives who are in the business of oil need to have a seat at the table. And so are the people who, like us, who might be consuming the products of that. And so a lot of this, can be very, very practical. We just don't do it. We tend to like to do this thing called they're good, we're good, they're bad, vilify the other person's point of view, and actually not make progress in understanding that we have to evolve these systems. What would a post-petroleum-based world look like tomorrow if we shut off all the petroleum? Well, it would probably mean that some really, really strange things would happen. We are not at all prepared for a post-petroleum world. And in fact, we may not even want a completely post-petroleum world. I don't know where we lie on that. But what we have to do first, instead of have these divisive conversations, is decide, well, what do we want in our world? Like, how much do we want to be able to travel around? Or how much stuff do we want that's disposable? How much time and energy should we make towards things that are more lasting and permanent? Or how are we going to use the resources of the earth? Who gets access to the natural resources of the earth? Who gets to manage and care for that? How do we make collective decision making? These things take a lot of work. And we believe that the first place to start that work is to look at what would the results of doing that work be like? What would the world be like if we reinvented our fuel technologies? What would the world be like if we gave indigenous wisdom a seat at the table? If we gave people of color equal access to power and money and a say? What would it look like? How would that function? And until we can imagine that, it's really, really hard to start taking actions to having that happen.
What that reminds me of is the importance of building bridges as opposed to creating walls. And how when we're able to do that, we can transcend the experience of knowing that we are going to need an intelligent planetary system to get us to the next level. But most importantly, we're going to need a planetary system that reveres wisdom, where it's not solely relying on quantifications and different ways of identifying insufficiencies, because I feel like the future cannot be usurped. It must be benevolently co-created for us to all come together, and nor can the future come from revering or vilifying the past in any way. And realize that what's happened up until this point, no matter how drastic or how amazing you think the experience has been, needs to come into a neutral place of understanding so that we can actually experience the observation of what has happened to all step into reality together. And what I'm saying is that we have an opportunity to take all of our world view perspectives and have this, like a quantum smooshing of all of our world perspectives. I'm not going to get too technical on it, but it's true. Like, because we can be in the same place, right here, right now, and be in two separate worlds.
That's right.
Completely. But how amazing could it be if our worlds began to collide and created a true vortex for us to create a real reality together, where it was more seamless than rigid and jagged.
Right. Well, and that starts right here at me, right? If I see the world in very fixed ways, this is this and that is that, and Rachel's over there and I'm over here, and I own a car and my car is blue, and like all these small little things that build up to this rigid point of view of the world. And hey, I have the things I have because I worked hard, or whatever my story is about, or I don't have anything because I was never given a chance, or whatever that story is. It's our attachment to those things that makes it hard for our worlds to and merge is not the right word, but to kind of infiltrate each other, so that I actually get a sense or a feeling of your world. And I'm going to make a point here. Trauma has to be healed. So if you have trauma, and that goes for individual trauma, collective trauma, cultural trauma. Obviously, our indigenous peoples in the country of the United States have some traumas from the perpetration of the past. Obviously, our Black brothers and sisters have trauma, and they have injustice. In both cases, it needs to be righted. So there's work to be done to get to the point where we actually have the capacity to let loose, and trauma work is really important, and we're not saying it's not. But what we are saying is there's something beyond trauma work. There's something beyond restoration. There's something even beyond regeneration. A lot of our friends are deep in the work of regeneration for the planet. We believe that the step beyond that is generation, imagining something new, imagining a new world for all of us. And we're going to get onto the second half of our topic here in a second. But so planetary is important. That there is a planetary capacity to communicate, to share worlds, to be inside of each other's worlds. And then at Boldly Now, we'd also say there's some really necessary ingredients for our future that we really have to get clear on. One is that humanity needs to be a net positive to the planet. We have to be able to stand for clean air, clean water, increasing biodiversity, not decreasing biodiversity on the planet, increasing richness of our topsoil. if we can get those things right as metrics, the rest of the future we invent is actually going to work out pretty well for the planet, at least. And then the second thing we really think is on a planetary level is that we really have to take care of some basic human rights for human beings. And I don't just mean rights like my liberty type rights, freedom, no slavery, things like that. I actually mean that I actually have right to a safe place to live in, to clean water to drink, to good and nourishing foods. Foods brought from the land that actually nourish my body instead of take things from it. And I have to be given the right to give my gifts on this planet, to actually do what makes me come alive, to make my contribution. So we kind of have these two worlds that we really feel are fundamental to a future. One has something to do with the planet and humanity being a net positive, and the other has something to do with humanity and how we can provide this safe space for human beings to be humans. And then anything else outside of that, we really feel needs to be dealt with on a very local level. In fact, a hyper-local level. So we have planetary and we have hyper-local. Let's talk about hyper-local for a minute.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me, I think one of the most important pieces of hyper-local in regards to this world smoosh, as we call it, in this amazing scientifically new term that we've just created, is that you actually identify this smooshing from the aspect of looking at it with a semi-permeable membrane,
Right.
meaning that things can easily be interchangeable and interoperable within that system. So they're not stacked on top of each other in a solidified way, but they become more gel-like with each other, so that the best of humanity, the best of our intelligence, and the best of our wisdom can actually share freely within that communication and in that conversation and in that dialogue that I think we're going to have to take very earnestly from this point into the next definite 10 years, and even so on and so forth beyond that, because we're really going to need to have our ability to hear each other from a hyper local space and know truly what a person needs in each watershed region or bioregion, and not assume what we think people in the Amazon need if we've never been there and had any communication with anyone there. I remember a story from when I was visiting over there that one of the locals was telling me about how somebody came in and purchased homes. They thought that they needed homes for the place, and so they made basically tin homes for a lot of the indigenous people to live in. But what they didn't know is that the materials that they were using to make the homes that they already had was the thing that they needed given the heat and humidity. And every one of those homes essentially became trash because they became ovens.
Right.
And so without understanding the place that you're actually in, you can't assume you know what a group of people need without a moment of connection.
Right.
And then an intelligent way to reverse engineer and redistribute that information into a practical, meaningful way.
Yeah. And our friends over at the Hunger Project have been doing a lot of community development based upon coming in and not bringing. They don't bring a project to a community. They first of all they bring a conversation to the women. They enroll the women in a conversation of, well, what's important to your village or what's important to your local area, and if you guys were to come together to dream up something new, what would that be? And so just notice the power of inquiry. So there's kind of a mindset that has kind of fueled colonialism from the very beginning of time, which is a knower mindset. I know what indigenous people in southeastern New Mexico need. I know what the indigenous people in California need. So I'm, as the patriarch, I'm going to come in and give that to them. Wow, what a huge mistake that was, right? And if you look at kind of thousands of years of that a belief that I know better than, and how much damage that's caused, versus if you step into the world of inquiry always ends with a question mark. It's a learner mentality. It's I don't know, but I'm here to help to be a gift, to be a stand for whatever you need. I'm here to be of service. And ultimately that inquiry may turn out to be, we don't need you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. And it's a super valid thing for maybe a community to come to their own sovereignty and say, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for your help, but we don't need your help. So I think one of the things as we start looking to a future, we're not talking about creating a colonial future. We don't want a future. In fact, the parent body of Boldly Now is called the Generative Futures Initiative. Not future, but futures, because there are many different futures, and many of those futures are hyperlocal. And we believe that in 100,000 years, there could be even more diversity of culture and tradition than we have certainly now. And maybe in a way, a restoration of local culture and tradition. The drive, especially from the colonialization of the Americas, was to drive towards Christianization, a Western Christianization of the world, and a single worldview. So we have monotheism, but we also have monoculturalism that did a lot of that oppression. So what is the opposite of that? Well, we think hyperlocalization has a big part to do in that. It's really what is the right fit for this ecology, for this spot on the planet, for these people who reside here together. And I want to make sure not leave the nomads out who don't actually live in a single place, that maybe live all over the planet, that they too have a role to play in these conversations. That being said, a lot of these kind of planetary communication technologies, the ability to have a care and concern for the global commons and for humanity, and yet at the same time not have a single vision of what that might look like anywhere you go. And that's a tightrope. That's a balancing act, and one that humanity has not been very good at, and one that we believe, and Boldly Now is a big stand for this in education and programs to help us to learn to be very, very good stewards of both the planetary and the hyperlocal.
Absolutely. And I just want to touch on one of the things that you said about sovereignty and saying, no, thanks, we don't need your help. However, we would be happy to engage with you in an exploratory conversation of what working together could look like. Right? Because we're here in the process and we're in the magic of building bridges. Because I know that what's coming up next, we are going to need all hands on deck. And this conversation that we're having this week quite possibly could open us up to the possibility that more help that we may have not always believed in could be on its way if we allowed it to come through us, not some spaceship that's going to land on the White House or something like that, but allow universal intelligence to actually come through us in a new way that allows us to get to the places that you just spoke to.
Do you mind if I geek out a little bit? I'm going to wax.
100%. No, go leave this in. We're not cutting.
I would just I think of the work done by Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek, and we just spoke about anti-colonialism, and the prime directive of the Next Generation Star Trek series was clear to not interfere in cultures, right? To observe and to exchange, but not to interfere. So a non-interference policy, and we wish we had had that during the age of colonialization for sure. We would have had so many treasures held for future generations on this planet. But if I think about, so I've been a science fiction and a space fanatic since I was very, very young. And in fact, my obsession with future generative futurism really comes from the same place. When I think about it, I've always wanted to meet alien intelligences and have that kind of level of exchange, and really, maybe up until this point in my life, if I could, go explore the universe, I'd certainly want to do that. And I think there's something really important about that, in the sense that, we have been the aliens on this planet in many cases. especially the white culture who spread across the planet. We were the aliens. And so I think a lot of our tropes of fears about extraterrestrial life come from that. And certainly we have something to learn about ourselves in contemplating intelligent life off the planet that may be as important as actually discovering intelligent life off the planet. And that is that we not only exist in an earthbound ecology, we actually exist in a universal bound ecology, at least in our known universe, the universe that we can see in our inside of our light cone, of the universe that we know led back to some kind of singularity. There's something to say for the amazing emergence of consciousness, of self-awareness here on this planet, and something of deep and profound reverence for the improbable conditions that led to us to be able to have this conversation today. So, I've just gone from Star Trek to, cosmic consciousness or collective consciousness in one bound. But I think the kind of reverence for life and all life may be one of the most important human values that we can grow and maintain, and especially hand down to future generations.
Absolutely. I'm hearing the words of a dear friend, where she said that we are ready to have close encounters of our own kind, with our own kind. And I'm curious, how many of us have actually had that experience, to have a close encounter with our own kind? And for us to even assume that we would be ready to accept the wisdom and love and care from any outside source other than which was in this biosphere at this very moment would be an absurd idea if we weren't willing to look past simple things that keep us differentiating ourselves from each other. Right? You look at adding 3 new codes of a DNA strand or something like that, or shiny skin, and then there'd be mass mayhem. And there was a conversation that I remember of not stepping into these types of conversations with fear. Because if you could imagine, you're a parent and you come down the stairs and your child sees you and screams bloody murder, and they're terrified, and you're their parent, you have so much love for them, but every time you took a step closer, the child would scream in terror and fear. You would slowly back up the stairs because you love that child so much, and you would not come back down from the stairs because you did not want to terrify your child until they were ready to see you as for who you really were. And I really feel that we might be in an experience like that, where we have to be ready enough to experience first encounters of our own kind, as well as first encounters of anything else that could be possible.
Well, and kind of connecting back to our earlier conversation, we're not really ready to receive the wisdom of our own elders on the planet, much less intelligence from off the planet. And so I think certainly the biggest step that we could say towards being prepared for an encounter like that would be, wow, we have to be willing to be able to be in dialogue with people we don't agree with people that have a different worldview. Talk about a different worldview, try a different biology. And you might even begin to consider, we play around with time an awful lot at the Generative Futures Initiative. And what if an alien or an extraterrestrial intelligence experienced hundreds of years like we experienced minutes? We would be literally moving too fast to even be able to speak with them. And that wouldn't be a problem of lack of wanting to communicate. It's just our time frames may not match up. Our time way that we experience time might not match up. And there's some great kind of very far out cosmological conversations around time and the way we experience time may be a very, very localized phenomena. And so, I think is when we start looking into the future, we obviously are exploring things like humans in space, but it gets very, very, very interesting very quickly when you begin to imagine that the way that we experience space and time may actually be unique to human existence, and if it is unique to human existence, it may not translate to any other kind of intelligent life type existences. That's not good nor bad. It's just to broaden the scope of the dialogue of what we might consider our place to be in the universe. A very unique one, and a very beautiful one, and one right now that needs to be getting into action to get its own house in order.
Absolutely. And the sooner that we can identify, a friend of ours today was saying, we the planet.
Yep.
If we can identify as we the planet, then maybe we could be we the universe. And maybe when differentiating viewpoints or conversations came up, we allowed ourselves the interplanetary dimension experience of being an honored guest into another person's worldview and begin to transcend and traverse worlds and universes right where we are, and allow the intelligence of each one of those worlds and each one of those universes to fully integrate into ourselves, and then come to an intelligent synthesis of the combined information that creates a new thought for the world, which is actually what's needed right now.
New thinking, new world, new future.
New you.
Yeah, a new reality. So I think that's about it for our time right now. I'm Michael-Shaun Conaway.
And I'm Rachel Morrison.
And you have been watching the Boldly Now show. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you soon again.
The Boldly Now show, igniting the world of burning desire, big ideas, and bold action.